April 1946. The Arizona sun blazed overhead, casting sharp, unrelenting light across the dusty yard of Camp Florence. 18 women stood in a tight line near the administrative building, their gray uniforms faded almost white by the desert. Their faces were drawn, their eyes anxious. They were prisoners of war, German servicewomen who had once worked radios, stitched wounds, and deciphered weather maps. Now they were nothing more than numbers with names barely remembered by a war that had supposedly ended. Captain Ruth Morrison watched them from her office window. In her hand was a single sheet of paper that weighed heavier than any battlefield order she'd ever received. It was the repatriation directive, final, non-negotiable. All German POWs, regardless of gender or circumstance, were to be returned to Europe within 6 weeks. As she glanced out again at the women, some with arms crossed, some gripping their elbows, some simply staring into the sand, she realized this was not a moment of liberation. It was exile. Among the group stood Margarethe Klein. Her fingers curled tightly over the wooden rail just outside the building, knuckles white. The desert wind tugged at her thin sleeves, but she hardly noticed. There was a tremble in her jaw, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to say. In carefully practiced English, she spoke to the officer behind the desk. "Please, we don't want to leave." Her voice did not beg, it pleaded with dignity, a cry not for mercy, but for sanity. Behind her, the other women listened in silence. Their faces bore the unmistakable strain of something deeper than defiance. It was the weight of knowing what waited on the other side of freedom. War had stolen their cities, occupation had poisoned their homes, and now the only place that had offered them routine, shelter, and something close to peace was about to be taken away. For the first time, they feared what came after the gates. Margarita had come to Camp Florence emaciated and sleep-deprived. She had expected punishment. Instead, she had been given oatmeal with sugar and coffee that actually tasted like coffee. She remembered holding the spoon with shaking fingers, certain the food would be snatched away as a cruel trick, but it wasn't. The kindness had been real, persistent, confusing. Slowly, her body began to heal, but her mind remained haunted by what she had left behind. For 18 months, these women had lived not just in captivity, but in a strange kind of sanctuary. Not one free of pain or memory, but one that provided something their homeland no longer could: safety. There were no bombs overhead, no shouted orders, no trenches. They folded laundry, wrote letters, learned English phrases, and pressed flowers into notebooks like schoolgirls rediscovering youth. Their guards said, "Please" and "Thank you." It was disorienting. Captain Morrison had processed hundreds of POWs during the war. Every single one had counted the days until repatriation. But these women, these few dozen stranded in a sun-bleached corner of the American Southwest, were the first to plead for delay. They didn't want parole. They didn't want a ticket home. They wanted to remain, even in a country that had once called them the enemy. Because here, they were treated like human beings. The paradox was almost unbearable. The prisoners, once enemies, now begged to stay. The Americans, once victors, were bound by duty to send them back. Everyone played their part in a system that hadn't anticipated what kindness could do. What do you do with a woman who fears freedom more than chains? How do you explain to her that peace doesn't always mean safety? As the sun climbed higher, its heat bounced off the ground like memory itself, unforgiving, omnipresent. Inside the office, Morrison lowered the paper onto her desk. Her eyes met Marguerite's through the open door. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things that no regulation or protocol could answer. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between prisoner and officer: recognition. They were both trapped. Only one of them still had a choice. The morning Marguerite received her first paycheck, she stared at the envelope like it was a riddle. It wasn't much, 80 cents a day for laundry work, but it came with a signature, a date, and her name spelled correctly. Captain Morrison had handed it to her personally, explaining that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to wages for non-military labor. The words sounded unreal, as if spoken in a dream. For 3 years, Marguerite had known only orders, silence, and deprivation. Now, in the middle of the Arizona desert, she was being paid for her time. There was no humiliation in the work. Folding uniforms, scrubbing linen, mending seams, these tasks grounded the women in rhythm and purpose. They weren't forced or punished into submission. Instead, they were offered structure and dignity, and that was perhaps more disarming than cruelty could ever be. Many of them, still reeling from the collapse of their nation, welcomed that routine like a lifeline. Each day passed with more predictability than the last. The guards treated them with courtesy, often uncomfortable but unmistakably genuine. They said good morning and made eye contact. When supplies were dropped off at the barracks, they asked if anything else was needed. That simple civility, something that had been absent for years, began to erode the hardened edges of the women's fear. It wasn't just that the Americans were not cruel. It was that they were kind in quiet, consistent ways. The women didn't know how to interpret it. Liesel Hoffman, once a nurse in Dresden, quickly became an unofficial medic in the camp. When one of the prisoners burned her hand while boiling water, Liesel treated it with practiced hands and quiet efficiency. Her training had come from battlefield trauma, Normandy to be exact. She told no one at first, ashamed of where she had been and what she had done. But healing was in her bones, and in this place it was needed again. Corporal Davis, an American medic assigned to the camp, noticed her skill and began bringing her extra supplies. He taught her English terms: antiseptic, suture, gauze. Their interactions were brief and professional, but slowly Liesel began to speak more. When he once commented that she was very good at this, she finally responded, "I was good at it in Normandy too." It was a confession, and he didn't flinch. He simply nodded and said, "Then war is stupid." She agreed. Letters trickled into the camp through Red Cross channels. Each arrival was met with a breath held, a name called, a trembling hand extended. Most of the news was grim: cities destroyed, families scattered, parents presumed dead, children missing. One woman learned her house had been reduced to ash, her brother conscripted and executed in the final months of the war. Some letters arrived with only a few lines, devastating in their brevity. Others never came at all. Evenings became a time of cautious gathering. The women would read their letters aloud to those who didn't receive any. They translated the American newspapers too, huddling together in the common room. That's how they first learned about the concentration camps, not the POW camps like theirs, but the others, the ones with smokestacks and numbers burned into skin. Some women refused to believe it. Others cried silently. Margarete read the reports again and again. She studied the photographs, grainy and horrific. She remembered how they were told they were fighting for honor, for survival, for their homeland. Now she saw what that had meant. The guilt was sharp and corrosive, threading itself into her bones. She didn't know how to explain it. All she could do was keep folding sheets and writing careful, uncertain letters to a family she might never find. Captain Morrison watched these women with growing complexity. Her brother's death had left her bitter, and she had volunteered for this duty expecting to feel nothing but contempt. Instead, she saw frightened young women, some hardly older than her students had been before the war. She watched them mourn, adapt, and even laugh on occasion. The enemy, it turned out, was often indistinguishable from anyone else. The camp became more than a holding facility. It became a strange, suspended world, outside of time, outside of vengeance. Ruth approved small comforts, a tiny library of donated books, permission to sing folk songs in the evening, paper and pencils for journaling. She didn't see it as indulgence, she saw it as recovery. Not redemption, perhaps, but recovery. In that suspended space, something fragile began to grow. Trust. The women started to leave their boots outside their bunks. They stopped whispering at night. They asked questions, requested dictionaries, tried to understand the words printed in the American news. No one called them traitors here. No one spit at them. For the first time in years, they began to see themselves as more than the sum of their uniforms. Peace, in Camp Florence, came slowly and without announcement. It wasn't declared with parades or flags. It arrived in small details. A laugh at lunchtime, a flower pressed in a notebook, a clean pillowcase that smelled of sun. It felt tentative and temporary. But for the women who had expected punishment and received patience, it was enough to make them hope. And hope, they were learning, was the most dangerous gift of all. By early March, spring had begun to seep into the Arizona desert. It came quietly, small shoots of green sprouting near the fence line, a softness in the morning air. Captain Morrison approved the request for a small garden near the women's barracks, not because they needed food, the camp's kitchen was stocked, but because the women needed something to care for, something to anchor them in the present, something that might survive. The garden became a project of shared devotion. Marguerite planted tomatoes in neat, symmetrical rows. Her fingers remembered the rhythm of her grandmother's garden in Breslau, a place that no longer existed. Liesel chose herbs for their usefulness, chamomile for tea, lavender for headaches, mint for the scent of calm. Each sprout felt like defiance against the ashes of their past. Even the soil, foreign and dry, began to respond. Anna Werner, who had once taught literature in Leipzig, chose flowers. Bright marigolds and zinnias, the kinds of blooms that had no reason to exist in a prison camp. One afternoon, Ruth asked her why she had picked them instead of vegetables. Anna didn't look up from the soil. "Because we forgot that beauty exists," she said. The words hung between them, dry and heavy as the wind. The garden became a place of refuge. After chores were done, the women would sit along its edge, sometimes in silence, sometimes singing. The songs were soft, carried in the wind, barely audible beyond the fences. Some were lullabies. Others were old marching songs, repurposed now for something gentler. Guards who passed by rarely interrupted. They sensed something sacred was taking place. Corporal Davis, who had taken to teaching Liesel new medical terms, proposed a new idea over lunch with Captain Morrison, a talent show, an evening of performances, songs, recitations, even jokes, by both prisoners and guards. Morrison hesitated. It was risky. Fraternization had limits. But after some persistence, she agreed. She cited morale, Geneva provisions, rehabilitation. What she didn't say was that she wanted to see them smile again. The preparations began in secret excitement. Costumes were improvised from old sheets and borrowed uniforms. A broomstick became a microphone. Someone found a guitar. Liesel practiced a folk song from her childhood, one that mentioned mountains and home. She had to hum the melody at first, the words long buried under years of war. But they came back, slowly, like old friends. On the night of the show, the recreation hall filled with mismatched chairs and nervous energy. Ruth sat in the back, her arms crossed, unsure what to expect. The women wore their uniforms, but they stood straighter, as if the stage made them taller. Liesel went first. She sang her German song softly, then switched to an American one she had learned from the camp radio. "Don't Fence Me In." The lyrics were imperfect, the pronunciation broken, but the room was still. When she finished, there was a beat of silence. Then applause. not polite, but thunderous. Private Torres, whose cousin had died at the Battle of the Bulge, clapped the loudest. Later, he approached Ruth and said, "My grandmother used to say war belongs to the devil, but people belong to God." Ruth had no words in reply. She only nodded, her throat too tight to speak. That night, something shifted in the camp. The boundaries didn't disappear, but they blurred. The guards still carried rifles, the women still wore prisoner tags, but something like mutual recognition began to bloom. They had shared something human, laughter, song, a stage. And in doing so, they remembered that they were more than roles assigned by uniforms. Marguerite wrote about the talent show in her next letter, unsure if anyone would read it. She described the laughter, the strange joy, the sound of clapping echoing in a space meant for silence. She folded the paper carefully, as if the story might break on the journey. In the closing line, she wrote, "I forgot for 1 hour that we were prisoners." That hour lingered in the air for days. As the weeks passed, the garden began to bloom in earnest. The tomatoes ripened, the herbs thickened, the flowers burst into defiant color. Even the guards remarked on how beautiful it looked. For a moment, it seemed as if hope had taken root, thin and trembling, but alive. The women walked slower past the rows of green. They paused to breathe. They allowed themselves to believe that perhaps not everything beautiful would be taken away. Not yet. On April 2nd, the telegram arrived at Camp Florence just after sunrise. The envelope was thick and official, marked with the War Department's seal. Captain Ruth Morrison opened it slowly, already sensing what was inside. The language was cold and absolute. Final repatriation orders for all German prisoners of war. Men and women alike were to be returned to Europe by May 15th. No exceptions, no appeals. She sat at her desk for a long time, the paper limp in her hands. Through the window, she could see the women in the garden, tending to rows of herbs and tomatoes with quiet focus. They had no idea what was coming. Ruth thought about how she would tell them, how to put into words that their borrowed peace was over, that the place which had become their sanctuary would soon become a memory. There were no good words for that. For 3 days, she said nothing. She told herself she was waiting for clarification, for a call from headquarters, for someone to confirm this wasn't real. But really, she was delaying the inevitable. She walked the perimeter of the camp in the evenings, watching the women joke, read, laugh softly under the stars. They had built something fragile here, and she was about to dismantle it. On the 4th day, Ruth gathered the women in the common room. The Arizona sun cast long, golden lines across the floor. She held the paper in both hands as if it were a verdict. Her voice was steady, but her heart was not. "The War Department has issued final repatriation orders," she began. The words dropped into the room like stones into a pond, each one sending ripples of shock through the air. Margarete translatete den Announcement into Deutsch, her voice low und expressionslos. Die Silence, das folgte, war heavier als any scream. 4 Women stierten auf den Flur, andere stierten strahlerhellt. Samawan begann zu kreien, nicht laut, aber mit einem Tremor, das starrte in ihrer Käst und gruh, bis ihr hoher Baute schüttete. Anna Werner simple nodded, slowly and deliberately, like she had always known this moment would come. The garden withered almost overnight. The tomato plants turned brittle and brown. The herbs dried out in their beds. No one watered them. No one sang in the evenings. The vibrant, defiant corner they had built with such care was abandoned. Even the flowers, Anna's precious marigolds, drooped under the weight of neglect and heat. The desert reclaimed what it had loaned. Liesel stopped going to the clinic. She sat on her bunk for hours, staring through the wall. Corporal Davis tried to speak with her, but she barely responded. "What's the point?" she finally whispered. "I'll be setting bones in a place where there's no food, no medicine, no one left to heal." Her voice sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else. Margarita began writing letters to the Red Cross, to aid organizations, to churches, to anyone who might help. Her English had improved, sharpened by desperation. She wrote late into the night, her fingers stained with ink, her sentences stiff but clear. The responses trickled in, always the same: polite regret, procedural barriers, promises to review. Translation: there would be no help. Captain Morrison launched her own campaign. She called old colleagues, sent telegrams, typed up appeals. She cited their work, their transformation, their usefulness. Every reply came back stamped with the same bureaucratic finality. The wheels of war might have slowed, but the machinery of policy ground on, indifferent. Rules were rules. Time was running out. Colonel Price found Ruth one night, sitting alone in her office, surrounded by open files and crumpled drafts of letters. "You're too attached," he said quietly. "These are prisoners of war. This was always temporary." Ruth didn't look up. "They're people," she answered, "and we're sending them back to rubble, to ghosts, to places that don't exist anymore." Price didn't argue. He only walked away. The next day, another letter arrived. This one was for Marguerite, from her sister Clara in Munich. It was written in a hurried, uneven hand. The sentences were fragmented, the ink smeared. "Don't come back," it read. "The city is dying. Everyone is starving. I don't know how much longer And then, nothing. The letter ended mid-line, as if Clara had run out of strength or time. Margareta held the paper to her chest, feeling something inside her crack, not loud, but deep. That night, she went to the administration building. Ruth was there, still working, still trying. Margareta stood in the doorway, shaking but resolute. Her voice was low, barely audible over the hum of the ceiling fan. "Please," she said, "we don't want to leave." Ruth looked up, and for a long moment she said nothing, because she didn't have an answer. The night after Marguerite's quiet plea, Captain Morrison didn't sleep. She sat in her office, surrounded by papers, half-written letters, and empty coffee cups. The repatriation orders sat on her desk like a loaded weapon, final and unyielding. Every avenue she had pursued had ended in silence or denial. But something in Marguerite's voice haunted her, not desperation, but the steadiness of someone with nothing left to lose. Morrison realized she wasn't just fighting for delays. She was fighting for lives. At 2 a.m, Corporal Davis knocked on the door, holding a yellowed folder. "I found something," he said, his voice hushed but urgent. Inside was a memorandum from 1944, an old directive allowing POWs with specialized skills to apply for temporary civilian labor contracts in the United States. It had been written with engineers and mechanics in mind, but the language was vague. There was no gender clause, no clear restrictions. It was a technicality, but it was a door. They worked until sunrise. Ruth drafted applications while Davis compiled service records. They identified every woman with a skill that could be justified under the directive. Liesl had medical training and fluent English. Margaret had telecommunications experience from the Eastern Front. Others had worked in translation, sanitation, even logistics. Each file was assembled with the desperation of a final lifeline. It wasn't just paperwork, it was a case for mercy. Ruth contacted hospitals, churches, and civic groups. She called the Lutheran Church in Phoenix, the local telephone company, even a farmer who had previously employed German male prisoners. She explained the situation again and again, begging for sponsorships, letters of support, anything that could prove these women had value beyond the war. Some doors slammed shut. Others opened cautiously, with questions and caveats. But a few stayed open. By the end of the third day, they had 11 complete cases. 7 others had been rejected, too old, too ill, or lacking specific qualifications. Ruth stared at the names that hadn't made the list and felt the weight of each one. Every denial felt like a failure, even if it wasn't her fault. But time was running out. The transport was scheduled in less than 12 hours. She entered Colonel Price's office with the files in her arms, her face pale but determined. He read through them slowly, flipping through each page with a practiced eye. When he finally spoke, his voice was unreadable. "This is bureaucratic gymnastics," he said. Ruth didn't flinch. "It's using the system the way it was built to be used," she answered. "We have a legal opening. Let us take it." There was a long silence. Then Price leaned back in his chair, sighing deeply. "I fought in the last war," he said. "I remember what came after. The hunger, the chaos, the rage. Maybe we can do better this time." He signed the forms, picked up the phone, and started making calls. Doors that had been locked began to shift. Not wide open, but enough to pass through. That afternoon, Ruth called the women together one final time. Her hands trembled as she held the list of approved names. She called them one by one. Each name felt like a fragile gift wrestled from a system that didn't want to give. Margarita Klene, approved. Margarita gasped, her knees buckling as Liesl reached out to steady her. Liesl Hoffman, approved. Tears streamed silently down Liesl's cheeks. Then Ruth reached the last name. Anna Werner. She paused. Denied. The room went still. Anna stood slowly, her expression unreadable. "It's all right," she said. "If even one of us gets out, then it was worth it." Her voice cracked, but her posture never wavered. She turned to the others, and in that moment became something larger than herself, an anchor holding everyone else in place. They embraced like sisters, with tears and whispered promises. Marguerite clutched Anna's hand like it could keep her from fading. "All right, every week," she said. Anna smiled. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." They both laughed, though their eyes were red. Around them, the others packed quietly, aware that their time together was ending. Dawn would come too fast. As the sun broke over the horizon, a transport truck rumbled into the camp yard. Ruth handed each departing woman a sealed envelope, letters of reference, addresses of aid organizations, and a few dollars from her own savings. "You deserve more than this," she told them. "You are more than what the world thinks you are." They climbed aboard, one by one, their silhouettes framed by desert light. No one looked back. Ruth stood beside Price, watching until the truck disappeared into a trail of dust. "Do you think they'll make it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "I think," she said softly, "they've already survived the worst. Now it's up to us to make sure that means something." The garden behind the barracks still stood, withered but not dead, like hope. 1 month later, Margarita stood behind a switchboard in downtown Phoenix, her fingers moving confidently from cable to socket. The work was fast and focused, something she could disappear into. Her English had improved quickly, sharpened by necessity and the desire to prove herself. Her supervisor, a brisk, fair woman named Mrs. Patterson, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "You've done this before," she'd remarked. Margarita nodded. "In another life," she replied. Each day brought new challenges, but also new freedoms. She no longer woke at roll call. She could walk alone to the corner store. She could buy coffee with her own money and sit quietly in a park without fear. These were small things, but they felt enormous. She had no family nearby, no home in the traditional sense, but for the first time, she felt like she was part of something again. Not a nation, a community. Liesel wrote regularly from the hospital in Phoenix, where she had been placed as a civilian nurse. She treated soldiers who had fought in the Pacific and civilians injured in accidents or illness. Most of them never asked about her past. Those who knew didn't care. She was simply the German nurse, the one who always had clean hands and a steady voice, the one who didn't flinch at the sight of blood. One letter came from Germany, 3 pages of Anna Werner's delicate handwriting. She had made it to Stuttgart, where she taught English to children in a school rebuilt from the shell of an old church. The students were children of refugees, orphans, and scattered survivors. Her words were full of exhaustion, but also purpose. "You gave us a chance when the world said we deserved none," she wrote. "I'm trying to do the same for others now." Ruth Morrison, transferred back to Michigan after the camp closed, read Anna's letter sitting in her small garden. It was late summer, and her tomatoes were ripening. She had returned to civilian life, but something had shifted in her. The war had changed many things, her politics, her grief, her faith. But nothing changed her more than watching women she was supposed to guard teach her what mercy looked like. On her desk, she kept a photograph. It showed the women of Camp Florence in front of their garden, standing side by side, some smiling, some solemn, all of them marked by time. In the background were rows of blooming flowers, stubborn in the desert sun. Whenever Ruth doubted her choices, she looked at that photo and remembered that not all victories are won on battlefields. Some are won in silence, in defiance, in kindness. Margareta still wrote to Anna every week. Sometimes it was just a few sentences, sometimes pages. She wrote about work, about Arizona's unbearable heat, about the flowering cacti outside her apartment window. She included dried flowers from the camp garden, flattened between paper towels. "They survived the sun," she wrote. "So did we." Life moved forward in fragments. There were long stretches of routine, interrupted by sudden memories, voices in German, the smell of soap, the weight of a ration tray. The past hadn't vanished. It lingered quietly in the background, like a radio playing in another room. But the women were no longer stuck inside it. They carried it with them, yes, but they also carried each other. Years later, when asked how she had survived, Marguerite would sometimes smile and say, "I didn't, we did." Because that was the truth. None of them had made it through alone. They had clung to one another, passed strength like water in the desert, and planted things that had no business growing in war. And somehow, impossibly, some of those things had bloomed. What began as captivity had become something else entirely. Not freedom, perhaps, not yet, but a beginning, a place where forgiveness had room to grow, where the enemy became a neighbor, then a friend, then simply another person trying to make sense of what came next. In the end, it was never about the camp itself. It was about what they made inside it, a fragile world held together by trust, routine, and shared humanity. A world they had built in the shadow of war, only to watch it be dismantled by the return of peace. But they took something with them when they left, the knowledge that they were more than what they had been told to be. And so, when Margarita walked home each evening beneath the wide Arizona sky, she did not think of herself as a prisoner who had been released. She thought of herself as someone who had been believed in, someone who had asked, "Please let me stay," and, against all odds, had been told yes.